The sky was beginning to fade. Dinner had just been served, the warm amber light casting a half-real, half-illusionary sheen across everyone's faces. Evelyn held her wineglass, giving it a delicate swirl, and spoke with her customary smooth voice. "My son deserves a wife who knows her place." No one responded. Only the faint clink of a fork hitting a plate broke the silence. Marian set down her knife and looked up. Her voice was low, slow, yet firm. "Yes, and I just found that place." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a cold smile forming on her lips. "Oh? Where is that?" Marian held her gaze unwavering. "Outside this house." An envelope dropped onto the table. The sound of paper hitting wood was dry, sharp, like a fracture splitting the dinner in two. Jacob froze. Evelyn's smile vanished. No one reached for their wineglass again. Outside the window, the rain began to fall. Scattered drops at first, but enough to blur everything that had just been said. Marian stood alone on the porch, a thin coat pulled tight, her hand gripping the silver house key. The streetlights reflected off the distant ocean. The wind swept through, gathering the rain into streaks of inclined light. She whispered softly, her voice a quiet message to herself. "Sometimes, people don't leave because they stop loving, but because staying would make them disappear." She opened the car door, letting the rush of cold air wash over her, and drove away. Behind her, the house gradually shrank, leaving only a faint yellow light at the window, the place where things had never truly belonged to her. If you've ever had to choose between peace and your own self, stay tuned, because this is the story of a woman who learned to stand tall within the very walls that once broke her down. Subscribe to the channel to hear true stories, where every door that closes is a heart that opens. The wind from Maine's Bay swept through the pine trees, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of waves like the very breath of the ocean. The small white-painted wooden house, with its old tiled roof nestled halfway up the slope, creaked softly with every shift in the breeze. The late afternoon light spread gold across the porch steps and over my hands as I set down the pot of lavender. The scent wafted around us, warm, like a welcoming greeting from this new land. Jacob was busy carrying the last boxes of books into the living room. He looked up and smiled, a gentle smile, just as he had the first time I met him at that autumn fair. I spoke softly, almost like a vow. "This will be the beginning." He replied quietly, "We deserve a place that is just ours." The sound of the wind outside blended with his laughter, making me feel as if all the old wounds were finally left behind on the long road we had just traveled from Portland. I stood by the window gazing out. The ocean unfolded in a strangely calm, cool blue. I used to be afraid of loneliness, but this place seemed to soothe that fear. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in many years, I was choosing something that belonged only to me. I purchased this house in my own name, using the inheritance from my father, the man who taught me that freedom is a choice not everyone dares to keep. Jacob didn't question it. He simply held my hand tightly. "Are you sure?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled, his eyes full of trust. "I trust you." Sometimes, such brief sentences could melt my heart. Against the sound of the waves, I heard myself whisper, "I used to think that real love is when you don't have to explain anything." We set up a makeshift dinner table using cardboard boxes and uncorked a bottle of red wine left over from our farewell gathering. I poured 2 glasses, the kitchen lamp casting a golden glow on the wooden walls. There was no music, no need for toasts, just two people sitting across from each other, hands gently touching in the silence. "We won't let anyone else interfere, right?" I asked, half joking, half serious. Jacob nodded, his smile tender. "Of course not. This is ours." I believed him. I believed those words as surely as I believed in my own heartbeat. At 36, after years of running from invisible limitations, I thought I had finally found a place no one could touch. A place where the door would only open when we both agreed. Outside, the sun was sinking lower. The light dissolved on the ocean's surface like a breathing mirror. I leaned my head on his shoulder and whispered, "If there's anything sacred in this world, I think it's this moment." Jacob remained silent, tightening his embrace. And in that instant, I believed that true happiness isn't loud. It just needs to be quiet enough for you to hear your own trust. We celebrated with wine, the red liquid shimmering in the pale yellow kitchen light. Jacob refilled both glasses, his fingers still dusted with a trace of paint residue from the day's organizing. When his glass touched mine, the sound was a delicate, thin chime, like glass itself. I looked around the small wooden house. Everything was still bare. A few cardboard boxes, a curtain yet to be hung, a solitary wooden chair. Yet I felt complete, because in that moment the space seemed to hold only the two of us and the breath of the sea. The wind from Maine's Bay streamed through the window, making the curtain sway gently, carrying the smell of salt and damp pine needles. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of freedom run down my spine. The simple freedom I had lost living in the city, amid judging eyes and never-ending questions of why. Here no one asked what I ought to be. Here I could be silent without having to apologize. Jacob leaned back in his chair, squinting at me over his wine glass. "I still can't quite believe we actually pulled this off." "What do you mean?" "Leaving everything, walking away, starting over just like that." I smiled. "I think sometimes people need to go so far that there's no road left to turn back, just to figure out what they truly want." He nodded, pouring more wine. "Then let's make it work." I laughed, but a small weight settled in my chest, as if a part of me knew that no beginning is ever truly peaceful. Outside, the waves crashed against the rocky shore, a steady sound like the ocean's heartbeat. Amid the sound of the waves, I suddenly heard something else, tiny yet distinct. The shadow of a seagull flashing past, the sweep of its wing across the window frame. I watched it, seeing its body disappear into the violet-gray sky like a fragile premonition, thin as a thread stretched tight across the heart of stillness. "What's wrong?" Jacob asked. "Nothing, just a feeling." "Good or bad?" I smiled. "I don't know yet." He turned on some soft music, an old jazz tune that drifted through the room, melting into the scent of new pine wood. I put my feet up on the chair, resting my head on his shoulder. The light from the lamp shone on the ceiling, reflecting the red wine rings on the table. Everything shimmered like a scene in a photograph that you know will soon fade. As night fell, the wind grew stronger. I stood up and closed the open wooden door. The hinges squeaked softly, a sound like the house's own sigh. I turned back and saw Jacob clearing the table, his posture strangely peaceful. In the dim light, I thought to myself, if happiness were a room, perhaps it would look like this, warm, small, and fragile. I rested my forehead against the doorframe, looking out at the sea. The water was dark, the faint moonlight illuminating the whitecaps. Suddenly I felt a nameless fear, a fear that something would change, a fear that this peace couldn't last forever. Jacob came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "We'll be fine," he whispered. I smiled, nodding, but didn't answer. Inside, another voice still echoed, small, like the wind sneaking through a crack in the door. If I had known what was coming, perhaps I would have locked that door forever. Outside, the curtain stirred gently, the scent of lavender still lingering in the air. I touched the silver doorknob, hearing the slow tick of a clock behind me. There are moments so quiet you mistake them for happiness. But sometimes, That very stillness is the warning you haven't managed to hear.
That morning, the sky was covered in a pale mist, and the scent of sea salt drifted on the wind. The sound of an engine pulling up outside the gate made me look up from the breakfast table. It was a sleek, silvery gray car, the kind people drive when they want to be noticed. The door opened, and Evelyn, Jacob's mother, stepped out. She was wearing a wine-colored velvet dress, a silk scarf around her neck, and within a few steps the strong scent of her perfume had permeated the air. Her hair was neatly pinned up, her high heels sinking slightly into the gravel. The first look she gave me wasn't a greeting, but an assessing gaze, silently inspecting an object. "What a sweet house. Do you have a spare room?" She smiled lightly, her voice just warm enough not to be considered cold. I returned her smile, trying to sound natural. "Not many, no. We've just moved in." "Oh, so it's still very new then. I can still smell the paint." I heard something in that remark, a touch of judgment, a light brush that still left a mark. Jacob came out from the house, his face lighting up. "Mom, I thought you would call first." "I want to surprise you," she replied, placing her bag on a chair, her eyes still scanning every corner. Surprise. The word made my heart tighten slightly. Jacob went to make tea. Evelyn walked around, her fingers tracing the edge of the cupboard, the photo frames, the curtain I had chosen. "You picked the curtain color?" "Yes," I replied. "It's pretty, but maybe a little dark. A smaller house should be brighter." She smiled, a smile that wasn't exactly malicious, just accustomed to making decisions. The air slowly grew thicker. I could hear the thin, steady clinking of a spoon stirring in a teacup. Jacob sat down opposite his mother, his voice cheerful. "Mom, Marian bought this house with her inheritance money. What do you think?" "Money is one thing," she responded softly. "But the important thing is that you feel you belong." The statement seemed harmless, yet its resonance was long. I was about to stand up to fetch some pastry when I heard a small metallic sound. Jacob opened a drawer, rummaged for something, then turned back with a silver key in his hand. He offered it to his mother. "Here, Mom, you keep this one, the spare key." Everything seemed to pause for a beat. I froze, still holding the wiping cloth. The light streamed through the window, illuminating that shimmering piece of metal. For a few seconds, the scene played out in slow motion. The key dropped into Evelyn's hand, light and simple. But it sounded like a lock, opening a boundary I hadn't had time to build. "Jacob," I spoke, my voice low. He turned back, slightly surprised. "Is something wrong?" "It's just for emergencies," he said, his tone casual. I looked at him, then at his mother's hand, her finger, adorned with a pearl ring, turning the key over and over like a toy. "What kind of emergency?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Well, in case something happens to the house, or we're away." Evelyn smiled gently. "Or just if I want to stop by. Don't worry, dear. Family should always have a key." The sentence hung in the air, gentle enough to be almost reassuring, but it tightened my chest. I simply smiled, offering no reply. The key rested in her hand, reflecting the light onto the wooden ceiling. Outside, the sea wind blew, making the curtain softly sway. I took a deep breath, clearly smelling the perfume mixed with the scent of pine wood. A strange blend, both familiar and foreign, as if the house no longer belonged entirely to me. I placed my teacup down, forcing a smile. "I thought an emergency was a fire, not lunch." No one laughed. The silence poured into the room like smoke through a crack in the door. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly, her lips still tightly pressed. The typical expression of someone accustomed to being obeyed, not countered with a joke. Jacob quickly changed the subject, leaning down to stir his tea, as if he hadn't heard anything. The spoon hitting the side of the cup sounded cold, dry, and monotonous. You made it a bit strong, I said softly, just to break the quiet. Oh, I'll add some water. No need, I replied, then stood up to clear the plate of pastries. The atmosphere had completely shifted. Evelyn was silent, but I could feel her gaze following my every move. In the light, the silver key remained in her hand, occasionally flashing a thin sliver of light, like the edge of a blade. I could hear my heart beating, not forcefully, just steady, slow and heavy. It felt as though someone had silently crossed my threshold without knocking. I knew it was just a small object, but inside me, something was pierced for the very first time, fragile yet real. Evelyn stood up, walking around the room once more. You keep the salt cellar here? Yes. It would be more convenient on the left, she said, then moved it to the left as smoothly as if she had lived here for years. Jacob said nothing. He simply watched her, slightly awkward, then managed a smile. Mom is always so practical. Just habit, she replied, her voice sweet. Anyone who lives in this house will understand that. That last sentence sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know if it was because her voice was too calm, or because the phrase, "this house," suddenly didn't seem to include me anymore. I cleared the table, hearing the tiny clinking of glasses, crisp like the sound of glass breaking in the palm of a hand. Evelyn sat back down, turning the key between her two fingers, flipping it over and over as if measuring its weight. The gesture was repeated so often that I couldn't tear my eyes away. I turned my back, looking out the window. The sea wind blew, the white curtains swayed gently, and the scent of lavender was still there, but now mixed with that strange aroma, perfume, tea, and something that felt like intrusion. A whisper echoed in my mind, not exactly a thought, but the voice of intuition. Sometimes, betrayal begins with a small glittering object in someone else's hand. Outside, the sunlight grazed the tabletop, touching the cooling teacup. Jacob said something about the weather. His mother smiled, and I just stared silently at the lock on the door, wondering when this house would truly stop being my own. The next morning, I heard the sound of a chair scraping in the kitchen. It was an unfamiliar noise, one that didn't belong to our two-person rhythm. When I went downstairs, Evelyn was already there, her hair neatly tied back, yesterday's velvet dress replaced by a white shirt and an apron, as if she had been living here for ages. She was reorganizing the kitchen, every spice jar, every glass. Her hands, adorned with the pearl ring, moved gently but decisively, without asking, without hesitation. The teacup I usually left by the window was now tucked away in the cupboard, next to a set of mugs I never used. You left everything quite disorganized, she said, her voice calm, almost caring. Order is the foundation of happiness. I stood at the threshold watching. My gaze tracked her hand as she placed the salt jar. The small jar tapped lightly against the wooden countertop, a soft but heavy sound, echoing in the air like punctuation for a command. Are you planning on having breakfast? She asked without turning around. I replied. I'll make it. Take a rest. Family shouldn't stand on ceremony. I was silent. The statement seemed simple, but there was something in her tone that made it hard to breathe, as if the boundary between help and intrusion had been erased without anyone realizing it. The back door opened and Howard walked in, holding a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He was silent, giving a slight nod, his eyes gentle but tired. Morning, I said softly. Morning, he replied, then sat down at the table, his eyes still following his wife as she repositioned the sugar jar. No one spoke further. There was only the rustling of the newspaper and the faint clink of a spoon against a cup. I suddenly understood. He was the unwitting accomplice, the witness who never interfered, like a wooden pillar supporting the roof, standing there but never speaking up. Jacob walked in, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked around the kitchen, recognizing the change. "Wow," he chuckled. "It looks different." "Better?" Evelyn asked, a quick smile flashing. "Yeah, Mom just wants to help, right?" he replied, his voice cheerful and oblivious, which sounded to me like a thin, fresh cut. I looked around. The salt, the sugar, even the tea tray had been moved. Everything was neat, but only I felt displaced in my own kitchen. The light streaming through the window hit the countertop, brighter than necessary. I tried to smile. "Thank you, but I prefer to keep things according to my own habits." "Habits can sometimes cause stagnation," Evelyn said, still gently. "I just want you to find things more convenient." Jacob laughed, pulling out a chair. "You're blessed that my mother tidies up. You don't know this, but when I was a kid, our house was always as neat as a hotel." I nodded, saying nothing. Inside, something just slightly shifted, small, but as clear as when a glass slips from the edge of a table. It hasn't fallen yet, but you already anticipate the sound of the break. I washed a glass, trying to suppress a sigh. Steam rose, fogging the window pane, and in that blur, I saw Evelyn's silhouette folding a kitchen towel, slowly, precisely, like a host who knows the routine. Jacob continued chatting cheerfully while I stood there, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "Help or take over?" The question slipped out before I could swallow it back. The room fell silent. Evelyn stopped folding, turning her head, her gaze slightly raised, just a fraction, but cold enough to make the air contract. "Marian," she said, "you should understand that everything I do is because I want what's best for you both." Her voice was soft, but that softness carried the weight of a velvet-covered wall. Jacob stood awkwardly between us. "Come on, you two, don't be tense. Mom just wants our house tidy, that's all." I looked at him. Tidy? Or exactly the way she wants it? He avoided my eyes. "Don't make a big deal out of this. It's just the kitchen." "Exactly," I said quietly. "It's my kitchen." Evelyn smiled, walking closer and placing a hand on my shoulder. "We're all here, dear. There is no yours alone. Family is about sharing." I nodded grudgingly. In my mind, the word sharing suddenly sounded distorted. A kind of sharing that people only engage in when they are also taking more for themselves. Afternoon arrived. The light on the sea gradually turned a silvery gray. I cleaned up the kitchen, hearing laughter from the living room, Jacob's voice mixed with Evelyn's. Howard occasionally contributed a few short sentences, then went silent. Everything seemed peaceful, but there was a subtle dissonance that only I could hear. At night I went into the bedroom. The space was still, save for the wind whistling through the window crack. I changed my clothes, then paused as I approached the bed. A pair of Evelyn's slippers lay neatly beside my side of the bed, as if they had been there forever. I looked around. Nothing else seemed out of place, but the sight made my chest tighten. The small, soft beige leather slippers were placed tidily, like a silent declaration. She is here, and she will remain here. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my hand unconsciously touching the silver locket on the nightstand, the house key. It was cold. I couldn't remember when I had put it there. I lay down but couldn't sleep. The sound of the waves offshore blended with the rhythm of the wind passing over the tiled roof, like a steady, unbroken chorus. In that prolonged stillness, I realized some losses don't arrive with a crashing sound, but with the quiet shifting of every small detail. A jar moved, a teacup gone, a pair of slippers by the bed. Inside, a low voice whispered, "Sometimes loss begins when you no longer recognize the space around you." I closed my eyes, distinctly hearing the faint rattle of the door lock in the wind. A small sound, but enough to make me understand. The first boundary had already been crossed. I can't pinpoint exactly when it began. Perhaps it was the evening Jacob said, "Mom says she'll stay for a few days to rest before driving back." I nodded, thinking it would only be one night, for convenience. But a few days gradually stretched into a whole week, then evolved into a habit that no one bothered to name anymore. Evelyn and Howard began staying overnight. The living room became their room. The suitcase she initially brought was tucked neatly in a corner, but now it was wide open on a chair, clothes already hanging in the closet. The heavy scent of her perfume slowly permeated the hallway, to the point where I could no longer smell the lavender I once loved. In the mornings, Howard read the newspaper in his striped pajamas, the loud rustle of the pages drowning out the sound of the waves. Evelyn, meanwhile, cooked breakfast as if it were her natural duty. Jacob would smile. "It's nice having Mom stay. The house feels livelier." I could only smile back, saying nothing. Some invasions don't come by force, but by courtesy prolonged for too long. On Sunday, I opened the fridge looking for milk. It was empty. All the compartments, top and bottom, had been reorganized. My butter was gone, replaced by Evelyn's preferred almond milk and a jar of jam. At the dining table, I noticed 2 new chairs made of dark wood, mismatched with the original set. And the curtains, the ones I had carefully chosen from the small shop near the bay, had been replaced by a thicker fabric, adorned with an antique floral pattern. I didn't need to ask who did it. That evening, as I poured wine, I noticed a new wine glass sitting between the 2 old ones, crystal, brighter and different in style. On the wall, a new photo frame had appeared, a picture of Jacob and his mother taken years ago, before I was part of that canvas. I stood still for a long time, staring into Evelyn's eyes in the photograph. The gaze was identical to her current look, knowing her place, and not afraid to take it back. I could faintly smell a new, sweet, heavy layer of perfume in the living room. Each time the wind blew through, the scent wrapped around me like a persistent, unyielding mist. The house suddenly felt foreign, as if its very breath had changed ownership. Late that afternoon, Evelyn called me over. She was sitting on a chair, a teacup in her hand, her voice light as the breeze. "I just worry my son will live lonely as his father once did." I froze. Something in that sentence tightened my heart. Her voice was soft, but her words stabbed deep, like a thin needle passing through the skin of emotion. She looked up, her eyes subtly trembling, a mixture of affection and possessiveness. "Jacob needs a home with care," she continued. "You wouldn't know, but a lonely man will gradually grow cold." I managed a strained smile and replied just loud enough. "I think sometimes loneliness doesn't come from a lack of people, but from too many people forgetting where they belong." Evelyn offered no reply. Her gaze remained fixed, deep and composed, as if she had just heard something mildly interesting, not worth reacting to, only worth remembering. Jacob walked in, placing his hand on his mother's shoulder, his smile careless. "What are you two talking about so seriously?" "Nothing," I said, and looked toward the window, where the sunset was almost completely obscured by the new curtains. After that exchange, the room sank into silence. Jacob remained silent, as if he hadn't heard anything, or worse, heard it but chose to ignore it. He poured more wine, offered a faint smile, and changed the subject to Howard's search for an old boat to restore. I sat across from him, looking, realizing something in him had begun to shift too, just like everything else in this house. He didn't look at me when he spoke. His gestures, his tone, everything was normal, too normal to be familiar. When Howard got up to fetch the newspaper, and Evelyn began collecting the dishes, I suddenly felt like I was in a movie scene where the main character had been erased from the script, leaving only the setting. I realized I was losing small pieces of my life, each object, each habit, each space of my own. No one was stealing them, but everything was gradually being replaced by things that were supposedly better. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. On the wooden shelf, in the dim evening light, a small glittering object caught my eye. I picked up the silver key again. Still the same key, the one I had once believed symbolized a fresh start. Now, it lay cold in my palm, its reflection on the wall like a fragile, beautiful yet chilling streak of light. I turned it gently between my fingers. The sensation of the cold metal on my skin made me think of all the times I had opened the door to welcome others in, with trust, with good intentions, with the hope that kindness would bring peace. But perhaps I was wrong. From the living room, I heard Evelyn's laughter, her voice blending with the sound of wine glasses clinking. Jacob laughed too. The sound rang like glass shattering somewhere deep inside me, small but irreparable. I stepped onto the porch. The wind was cold, and the damp smell of the sea rushed in. Far away, the waves gently lapped against the rocky shore, each pulse reminding me that some things, once you let others cross the threshold, will never go back to how they were. I squeezed the key tight, whispering to myself, "Loving is sharing, but sharing is not surrender." The moonlight shone down on my hand, the key's metallic gleam reflected on the wall, the shape of a half-closed door. I looked at it, understanding that all disintegration begins with small details, and when you fail to hold on to the boundary, love will soon become a key held in someone else's hand. The afternoon sky was gray, and the clouds drifted low over the bay. I sat by the window, my teacup still steaming, the condensation blurring the glass pane. For the past few days, the house seemed only to hold the sound of Evelyn's footsteps, the rustle of Howard's newspaper, and Jacob's silence. Everything operated as if I were a boarder in my own home. I looked at the phone on the table, hesitating for a few seconds before dialing Laura Finch, Jacob's sister-in-law. Laura had a voice that put people at ease, soft, clear, and warm enough to make you believe she genuinely listened. The phone rang twice. "Marian, it's me. It's been too long." "Yes, I didn't mean to bother you. Just wanted to hear your voice for a minute." "Oh, don't say that. I'm always happy to hear from you. What's up?" I was about to say nothing, but the truth was right on the tip of my tongue. "Evelyn, has she been in touch with you lately?" Laura paused for a beat, then replied, "Almost every day. Why do you ask?" I touched my teacup, the ceramic cold against my skin. "I just find it strange. Since she's been staying here, Jacob hasn't talked about renovating the house anymore. And yesterday, I heard her mention the architect." On the other end of the line, Laura let out a breath so faint it was almost a whisper. "So you don't know yet." "Know what?" "Marian, you don't know? Their old house is about to be torn down and rebuilt." I froze. "Torn down? You mean the house in Portland?" "Yes. She said the place was old, the foundation damp and needed redoing. Mom wants to move in with Jacob. She said it will be more convenient for everyone." I couldn't speak. The room suddenly shrank, and the sound of the waves outside seemed to recede. Laura continued, her voice lowered, cautious. "Evelyn has decided to move in, and Jacob agreed to make caretaking easier." Those last words fell into my ears heavy as stones. "He agreed?" "He probably just wants to avoid confrontation." His mother. She knows how to make everything sound reasonable. I heard the sound of her spoon stirring her teacup on the other end, steady, like the rhythm my heart was trying to maintain. I think he's just trying to be a good son, she said softly. But Marian, sometimes people try so hard to be a good son that they forget they are a husband. I gave a faint, weary laugh. I understand. But it truly hurts when you realize the person you love is no longer standing on the same side. I know, Laura replied, her voice choked. You're not alone, okay? I looked out the window. The water had turned a leaden color, and gusts of wind whipping through the pine trees made the glass pane tremble slightly. I saw my reflection, blurry and lost in the mist. Perhaps all losses begin this way, not with an explosion, but with a piece of information spoken very softly, by someone who didn't intend to hurt you. Are you all right? Laura asked. I replied quietly. I'm not sure. Perhaps I just need a little more time to understand what I'm losing. I believe you are strong enough to understand and to choose, she said. When the call ended, I remained seated, listening to the sound of the waves blend with the tick of the wall clock. The second hand moved slowly, coldly. Outside, the last light of day bled across the sea, pale and thin, like trust being gradually withdrawn. I touched the teacup. The water was cold. A drop of salt mist from the sea air settled on my hand. Cold, salty, and so real that no one needed to say anything more. I put the phone down. The room was silent, as if the echoes of that call still lingered in the air. The late afternoon light shone obliquely through the window, casting pale gold streaks on the wall that were slowly fading. There were no voices, no wind, only the steady rhythm of the clock, as if counting every word Laura had just spoken. I sat there for a long time, my hand still resting on the phone, feeling as if someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Everything was intact, the chair, the cold teacup, the window opening to the sea. But I had the feeling I was looking at a house that had been hollowed out, leaving only an outer shell. I stood up and took a few steps around the room. The wind blew through the curtain, bringing the scent of sea salt and the fading sound of the waves. I thought I heard voices inside, Evelyn laughing, Jacob responding, but then realized it was just memory playing back. I sat down, opened an old notebook, then put down the pen. Whatever I wrote, the letters were crooked. Between the unfinished lines, I saw Laura's final sentence appear, clear enough to ache. Jacob said, he wanted to prove he's a good son. I closed my eyes. Those 4 words slid through my mind like a thin blade. A good son. A title beautiful enough to conceal all mistakes, gentle enough for people to forget that it could hurt others. I remembered the first time I met Jacob, he said, "You will never have to fight for your place in my life." And now, he was the one opening that door for others to step through. In the name of filial piety. I didn't blame him for loving his mother. I only felt pain because he didn't realize I was family too. Outside, the ocean gently lapped, the waves touching the shore like a soft consolation. But I felt no peace, only emptiness. Perhaps in every relationship, the most terrifying moment is not the argument, but when one person begins to fall silent because they understand they are no longer being chosen. I stood up, gently touching the photo frame on the shelf, the picture of us on the day we moved into the house by the bay. Jacob's smile then was so bright, his eyes full of trust when he looked at me. I quietly asked myself, when did he start changing direction? When did the promise of us become mother and son? I sat back down, slowly, almost whispering to myself. It turns out I was just the price he paid to keep the title of good son. The sound of my own words echoed in the room, small yet profound. I smiled. A pale smile, no longer bitter, just tired. Outside, the sunset was dissolving. The sea turned the color of ash. The wind whistled over the eaves, carrying the scent of wet grass and the soft creak of the wood. I placed the teacup in the sink, letting the water run over it. the warm stream soothing my cold palm. Perhaps tomorrow I would still talk and smile as usual, still set the dinner table, still greet Evelyn with a polite smile. But tonight I knew clearly. Something inside me had broken. Not with a sound, just a silent fracture. That night, the house was strangely quiet. There was only the sound of the wind seeping through the door crack, occasionally drawing in the sharp scent of sea salt. I walked around the living room, intending to clip a few dry lavender sprigs to put in the small vase on the table. As I pulled open the cabinet drawer to find the pruning shears, I paused. Amidst old papers and a few bills, there was a photograph. It was a picture of my mother. An old photo, its edges worn, the covering glass clouded by time. I pulled it out, bringing it closer to the lamp. Her face was faded, her eyes shadowed, but gentle and sad in a way I had forgotten. Her eyes looked weary, just like mine right now. Not the fatigue of work or age, but the kind of exhaustion that comes when the heart has to make too much room for others, when a woman has lived too long in a silence gently named sacrifice. I sat down on the chair, the photograph trembling slightly in my hand. My fingers touched the cold glass. The smell of wood, old tea, and Evelyn's perfume still lingered in the air. 3 clashing scents, yet strangely blended, like my own life. Suddenly tears fell, fast and unexpected, as if my body had waited too long to finally exhale. One drop landed precisely on the glass, touching the image of my mother's eyes. A small, faint sound echoed, like a knock on the door of memory. I closed my eyes and everything flooded back. Evenings Mom sat by the window knitting, the yellow lamplight shining on her pensive face. The time she smiled when my father was silent for too long. The phrase, "It's okay, dear," spoken only to conceal a fresh wound. I understood then. She too had once thought that love meant endurance. And now I was repeating it. The same script, only a different setting. I wiped the tear, but it left a blurry streak on the glass, as if the memory refused to be erased. The lamp's reflection on the photo made my mother's eyes shine, partly looking at me, partly looking into me. "I understand now, Mom," I whispered. "Silence isn't peace. It's just a way for others to think you're not in pain." I placed the photo on the table, my heart heavy. In the corner of the room, the looking glass reflected my form. A woman with messy hair and red-rimmed eyes. Not so different from my mother. Both of us had loved to the point of forgetting ourselves. I sat still, listening to the wind outside hit the door, a slow, insistent rhythm. As if the sea was also urging me to face what I had been avoiding. I gazed at the photograph for a long time. The small desk lamp cast a pale yellow light, like the last breath of the day. Everything in the room was so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking. Outside, the waves softly hit the rocky shore, like a weary heart slowing its beat. I gently touched my mother's face in the photo, my fingertip tracing the cold glass, and in my mind, her old advice rang. "Don't talk so much, dear. Everything will quiet down." I believed it then. Now I knew. Mom stayed silent, and the silence swallowed her. I saw her clearly in my memory. The woman standing by the stove stirring soup, while my father read the paper. Not speaking, not looking, just existing. The kind of existence society calls virtue. And now, I was walking that same path, except that I knew I was being gradually consumed, and I could no longer pretend to be tranquil. I looked around the house. Evelyn's new chair, the reorganized salt jar, the slippers still placed by the bed, her perfume clinging to the curtains. Nothing was broken, but nothing was mine anymore. The house was like a hazy mirror, reflecting my face, but with someone else's shadow behind it. I stood up, walking around, gently touching each item. The white ceramic cup, the slightly crooked painting, the key still on the shelf. Each was a small piece of evidence. Not enough to accuse, but enough to make me understand I was losing. A quiet thought crept into my mind, like a weak ray of light in a dark room. Perhaps it was time to do something. I returned to the desk, opening my laptop. The screen lit up, a cold blue light sweeping across my face. The cursor blinked on the search bar, small, patient, waiting. I placed my hand on the keyboard. Then I typed word by word, slow and steady. Janet, discreet real estate agent. I didn't know why that name came to mind. Maybe I had heard a neighbor mention it once. Or perhaps I just needed to type something out to feel I was still in control. The results appeared. A long list of names, neighborhoods, quiet transactions. I read, making a few notes. Inside me, something had shifted. Not pain, but determination. I opened a blank page, wrote down a few addresses, phone numbers, and then stopped. The screen reflected my face. Swollen eyes, disheveled hair, but a different look. Awake, clear. I spoke softly, as if reminding myself, when a woman stops begging, she starts planning. I closed my eyes. A long breath escaped from deep within my chest, heavy but true. I was no longer afraid. Not because I was strong, but because the fear had reached its limit with no space left to cling to. The wind from the sea blew in, causing the curtain to stir faintly. Moonlight shone through the crack, casting a faint streak of light across the desk. I reached for my mother's photograph, placing it next to the laptop. Her face, in that light, looked like she was smiling. "I won't repeat your mistake," I whispered. "I will not be silent." I saved the first few lines, then closed the machine. Inside the house, all the sounds remained the same. The distant waves, the chirping insects, and the steady breathing of the man in the next room. The man who had no idea that tonight I had begun to leave, at least in thought. I turned off the light, leaving only the desk lamp illuminating my mother's photograph. The light fell upon her face, then spread across the room, gentle as a blessing. I sat back, strangely calm, and knew, this night, for the first time in a long time, I was truly awake. The rain began softly in the afternoon. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a steady drizzle. Silver threads pulled taut across the window pane. The humid sea air blended with the rich aroma of the stew simmering in the kitchen, creating an air of counterfeit warmth. Evelyn cooked, her new apron neat, her hair pinned up, her face composed, as if this were her own home. Howard turned on the yellow light. Its soft glow spread across the dining room, setting an intimate scene. The kind of cozy tableau strangers would look at and call family. I set the plates and gently wiped the table, trying to hold a polite smile. The scent of the stew permeated the air, thick and sweet, utterly overpowering the lavender I had placed on the windowsill. Jacob moved between the table and his mother, pouring wine, his voice bright and easy, utterly oblivious. "See," he said, "this is exactly how Mom cooked when I was a kid. This is the taste of my childhood." "Thank you, Mom," I replied, my voice low and even. Evelyn turned back, giving a slight nod. "I just hope everyone enjoys it. Family eating together. That is what matters most." The atmosphere was perfectly familial indeed. If anyone were to walk in right now, they would see a peaceful picture. Dinner under soft yellow light, steaming stew, the soft laughter of men, and a benevolent older woman at the head of the table. Only I knew that in this picture, the protagonist no longer had a place. We sat down. We watched. The rain outside tapped a rhythm on the eaves, mixing with the gentle clink of silverware. Howard told old stories, his voice even and warm. Evelyn smiled, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction, and Jacob between them looked like a happy man. He raised his wine glass, the crystal light reflecting onto my face. "This is home for all of us now." For just a second, time seemed to stop. The sentence sounded casual, yet it fell on me like a heavy stone. I clearly heard the finality in the phrase, all of us. Two simple words that erased every boundary I had tried to keep. I set my fork down, looking straight ahead, no longer attempting to smile. That's right. Because this is the last dinner I will ever have here. The sound of the rain outside suddenly grew sharper. For a moment no one spoke. Evelyn froze, her hand still holding the ladle, her eyes wide but expressionless. Howard looked up, his back rigid. Jacob looked bewildered, his mouth slightly open, trying to form a word that wouldn't come out. I sat still, my back straight. My voice so calm it felt strange even to me. I will be leaving. Tomorrow. Are you joking? Jacob asked, his eyes a confused mask bordering on panic. I have never been clearer in my life. Evelyn slowly put the ladle down, the sound of metal against ceramic ringing faintly. Sweetheart, don't say such heavy things during a meal. I looked at her. Don't worry, Mom. I'm just speaking the truth. The air in the room changed. The light was still yellow, but now it made everything feel coated in a thin layer of smoke. The wine fumes, the steam from the stew, her perfume. It all combined into something stifling and heavy. Jacob placed his glass down, speaking softly. Marian, I think we need to talk later. There's no need, I cut him off. Everything that needed to be said you've already communicated by allowing others to stay. The waves outside crashed against the rock face, low and steady. I looked around the table, 4 people, a perfect dinner, lacking only the single thing that once gave it meaning, the feeling of belonging. Evelyn paused, the forced smile on her lips slowly contorting. She gave a slight, humorless laugh, tilting her head. Are you playing games, dear? Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp as a knife blade. Jacob turned to me, looking lost, while Howard bowed his head, his hands tightly clasped as if praying for someone. I remained still, feeling as if the entire room was swaying, with only the steady beat of the rain on the roof remaining. No, I said softly. I am not playing games. She laughed again, but this time there was no sound, only the faint wine-laced breath escaping her lips. Marian, you're tired. Can we discuss this later? Don't embarrass Jacob at the dinner table. I slowly reached into my bag, pulled out a beige envelope, and placed it in front of him. The paper inside was slightly damp, not from the rain, but because my hands were cold and shaking. Here, I said, the divorce papers. I have already signed them. Jacob pushed his chair back, as if he had misheard something profound. Are you out of your mind? No, I replied, my voice unnervingly calm. I have simply woken up. A silence fell amidst the sound of the rain. Evelyn looked at the envelope, then at me, her gaze cold, her voice slow. You don't understand. Marriage is not a game. People don't leave just because of temporary hurt. I looked directly at her. No. People leave when they know they are gradually disappearing. Howard quietly spoke. Marian, perhaps you should reconsider. There's no need, I interrupted, not loudly but with finality. I have said everything that needs to be said. Your mother wanted this house. Keep it. I only want my share back, the silence. Jacob looked at me, his voice trembling. You're actually going? I nodded. Tomorrow. Before you have a chance to wake your mother and ask her permission. He held his breath. There was nothing left to counter. Evelyn adjusted her ring, her lips tightly pressed. I saw a flicker at the corner of her eyes, not fear, but the anger of someone unused to being confronted. I stood up, gathered my napkin, and placed it on the chair. Before leaving the table, I spoke,
my voice soft as a sigh. I am not screaming. I am simply closing the door they walked through without asking. No one replied. The rain outside blended with the wind,
moaning like the sigh of the house itself. I walked into the hallway. The light behind me was still a warm gold, but inside, I felt only the cold clarity of resolve. Outside, the rain grew heavier. I opened the door and the damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of the sea and wet grass. I stood for a moment, listening to the water hitting the porch, then softly spoke to myself. Finally, I can hear my own voice. The door closed behind me, without a slam. There was only a soft sound like a breath, the sound of freedom beginning. The rain hadn't stopped when I walked out of that house. The street ahead was glistening wet, reflecting the streetlights like trembling ribbons of yellow fire. I left in the rain, my small suitcase trailing behind me, the wheels rolling over the pavement, creating a lonely sound that, strangely, felt like my heartbeat finally steadying. The silver key was still in my hand, cold, heavy, and silent. I gripped it tight, unsure why. Perhaps I simply lacked the courage to throw it away. The feeling of leaving what was once home wasn't exactly pain. It was more like when you know a wound has healed, but you touch it just to be sure that you no longer feel the sting. The wind from the sea blew back, pushing my hair behind me. The streetlight's reflection on the water blurred with every gust, and the sound of the suitcase wheels dragged on, gently rolling over small puddles. Thump, 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 like a slow soundtrack escorting someone out of their own memory. When I reached the bend in the road, I stopped. The house behind me faded into the rain, leaving only the faint yellow light at the window, flickering like a dying flame. I looked at it one last time, without crying, only whispering, "Goodbye." It wasn't a farewell to the people inside, but to the part of me that had tried so hard to stay, the part that was too tired to remain. I drove to a small coastal town about 15 miles away. The motels lined up, white walls, old wooden doors, the smell of salt clinging to every railing. I rented a room near the sea, on the second floor, with a window facing the shore. The landlady was a thin, kind Maine widow who asked only one question. "Are you going far?" I replied, "Far enough to start over." She smiled, handed me the key, and asked nothing else. The room was small, with only a single bed, a small table, and a dim lamp. I put down my suitcase and opened the window. The sound of the waves rushed in, steady and real, like the lullaby of freedom. I sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the wind blow across my face. No one called my name, no one asked what I wanted for dinner tonight. There was only the wind, the rain, and the salty sea air. I inhaled deeply. In that scent, I recognized a strange feeling, not joy, but lightness, like someone who has finally taken a breath after days of being underwater. The next morning I made coffee with the electric kettle in the room. The aroma of coffee spread, mixing with the smell of old wood. I opened my laptop, my hand still slightly trembling. There were hundreds of things to do, but I opened only one document. Property transfer, 184 Bayview Road. The words blurred in front of my eyes, but I steadily signed my name. I finalized the house sale papers, my hand shaking yet firm. When the mouse cursor clicked the Submit button, I heard the sound of the waves intensify. Or perhaps I only imagined it. Maybe the sea was witnessing what I had just done, closing a chapter with my own hand. I sat still, my heart empty, then slowly warming. Everything behind me had gone silent. In the afternoon, the clouds drew low again. Gusts of mist from the sea crept up to the window, blurring the glass. I sat at the table, the laptop still open, the paperwork neatly stacked beside it.
Everything was done. There was nothing left to hold on to. Then the phone began to ring. Once, twice, and then 3 times. Jacob called constantly. His name flashed brightly on the screen, reflected on my cold coffee cup. I didn't move. I just watched. Each time the ringing stopped, I thought it was over. But only a few seconds later, the sound resumed, persistent, like the knocking of someone who refuses to understand that the door is now locked. I raised my hand, my thumb hovering near the answer button, but I stopped. In my mind, I heard his voice, familiar, gentle, but also the voice that had made me silent for too long.
Don't overreact. I'm just trying to make everyone happy. You know I didn't mean any harm. Those were the phrases that used to soften me. But today they were only hollow echoes dropping into my heart like small stones hitting cold water. I let the phone ring until the screen went dark, then silence. I looked at the screen, not answering. Outside, the waves beat steadily. The wind hitting the wooden roof sounded like the peaceful sigh of someone sleeping soundly. I leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling, my heart empty but strangely light. In that stillness, I spoke softly, my voice trembling like a prayer. Mom, I chose differently. I didn't know who I was speaking to, the mother in the photo last night or the quiet woman who had lived inside me for years. But the sentence echoed and dissolved, leaving a surprisingly warm void. I walked out onto the porch. The sky was still gray, but the rain had stopped. The sand was wet, the wind salty, and the sea surface glittered with a silvery sheen. I stood there, my hands in my jacket pockets, my breath mixing with the cold mist. In the distance, a seagull flew low, its wing cutting across the horizon, leaving a small white streak against the leaden sky. I watched it, my heart as light as that streak, thin, fragile, but heading in its own direction. In my mind, my voice rang out, clearer than ever. Sometimes salvation is leaving, not staying. There was no longer anger, no resentment, only the cold air and the gentle truth that some doors must be closed so we can breathe. I turned the silver key in my hand. For the first time, it didn't feel heavy. The faint light reflected on my finger, thin, small, but shining brightly in the twilight. I put it in my pocket and turned back into the room. The small room still held the light, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. I sat down, took a deep breath, and knew clearly I no longer belonged to the house by the bay. Saturday morning, the sky was strangely clear. After days of rain, the clouds had dispersed, revealing a pale gray expanse that reflected onto the bay's flat surface like a mirror. The light was cold, thin, and crisp, spread over the path leading to the old house, the place that had once meant everything to me. I stepped out of the car with Janet, the real estate agent I had been in contact with over the past weeks. She was concise, composed, her long charcoal coat fluttering lightly in the wind. Janet said nothing, only giving me a brief glance, enough to let me know that she understood. This was more than just a transaction. The house by the bay stood before us, its roof tiles damp, the windows still adorned with the thick, cream-colored curtains Evelyn had chosen. I paused for a few seconds on the stone walkway, where streaks of moss were already growing back after the rain. The scent of the sea lingered, mixed with the smell of old wood, making my heart feel both heavy and strangely calm. Janet looked around, her voice soft. "It's beautiful. It probably won't be hard for someone else to fall in love with this place." I nodded quietly. Maybe. As long as they don't force the house to forget its past. We walked up the steps to the porch. As Janet rang the doorbell, I felt my heart beating slower, steadily, no longer in the frantic rhythm of the last time I stood here. The door opened. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his shirt unbuttoned 2 ways, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. His face was drawn, but still held that familiar gentleness, the gentleness that had once made me believe in the unreal. "You came back?" His voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept enough. I smiled, meeting his gaze. "Yes, for the handover." The air between us went silent. Janet offered a polite nod, opened her briefcase, and spoke in a professional tone. "We are here to finalize the last part of the contract. I need both signatures." Jacob glanced at me, his eyes half surprised, half disappointed. "I thought you would change your mind." I spoke gently. "No, Jacob. I just changed my life." A gust of wind from the sea swept in, making the curtain behind him sway slightly. I saw the room inside, the dining table intact, the lavender I had planted now just dry stalks. On the table, Evelyn's crystal glassware was still shining, lined up neatly as always. Everything was in its proper place, except that there was no place left for me. Janet put the papers on the table, beginning to guide him through the lines. Jacob sat down, flipping the pages, his gaze lost somewhere far away. I stood by the window, my eyes directed toward the sea. The light reflecting on the water was so brilliant it made me squint. He finished signing, put down the pen, and looked up. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" I smiled faintly, without sadness. "Stay for what? I left a long time ago. It's just that my body only caught up today." Janet was silent, nodding subtly, as if confirming something that had already been decided. I looked around the house one last time. Everything was the same, but the only thing that had changed was me, a person who no longer wanted to seek approval in her own life. From the hallway, the sound of heels approached, slow and deliberate. Evelyn stepped out, wearing a cream-colored wool shawl, her hair neatly pinned up, still exuding her usual confidence, except that her eyes flashed with a momentary confusion when she saw me standing there. "Marian," she said, her voice even, as if this were just a normal Saturday morning. "What is this? Is that Janet?" Janet nodded slightly. "Hello, Mrs. Ellis. We are here to complete the final procedure." Evelyn looked at me, a faint smile on her lips. "Handover of what?" Her question hung in the air, brief, but laced with possessiveness. I looked straight at her, not flinching. Janet placed the folder on the table, opened it, and spoke calmly. "This house has been sold. You can review the contract here." The air in the room grew heavy, as if someone had just drained all the warmth from the space. Evelyn paused for a beat, her smile gradually fading, her eyes blinking slightly. Only once, but enough for me to recognize the confusion behind the layer of pride. "Sold? She sold it?" Her voice cracked, but she instantly regained her composure. "Jacob, did you know about this?" Jacob didn't answer. He sat still, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. Janet handed him the confirmation paper to sign, and he did so in silence. I watched the scene with a strange serenity, no longer angry, no longer hurt. Only clarity remained. I opened my bag, took out the silver key, and gently placed it down on the wooden table. The cold light from the window shone on it, making it briefly sparkle. Then it lay still, glittering, solitary, and decisive. "This is for the house," I said, my voice low and soft. "I trust you know how to keep it, as it was what you wanted most." Evelyn stood motionless, her lips slightly parted, as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she only let out a long breath. Jacob looked up at me, his eyes holding a mixture of regret and belated understanding. I smiled at him, lightly, like greeting a stranger. "Jacob," I said, "I hope you find happiness. But if that happiness has to be bought with the silence of another person, it will not last." No one said anything further. Janet closed the folder, put her pen in her briefcase, and nodded to me. "It's done. Everything is complete." I nodded my thanks. The room sank into silence, with only the sound of the waves outside hitting the rocky shore, distant and steady. I looked back one last time. The painting I had hung years ago was still there. The photo frame of us from the day we moved in still tilted on the shelf. But I didn't want to fix it anymore. Everything now belonged to them, and I no longer needed it to define myself. I turned my back and walked toward the door. My hand touched the doorknob, cold but familiar. I whispered softly, almost only for myself to hear. The last time I handed a key to someone else was when I learned the value of keeping myself. Then I pushed the door open. The wind from the sea rushed in, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of freedom. I stepped onto the porch, letting the door close behind me, without a slam, just a small click, enough to affirm I had left my old life behind. On the table inside, the silver key remained, shimmering under the dim light, like a beautiful period mark for a chapter that would not be reopened. Before the door could fully close, the sound of a chair crashing echoed behind me. Evelyn screamed, her voice tearing sharply through the humid air. "You cannot do this!" I stopped on the porch, turning around. In the cold light, she stood in the middle of the room, her face flushed, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if afraid of falling. Her neatly pinned hair was now messy, strands of gray clinging to her forehead. She no longer looked like the elegant, composed woman I once feared, but like someone who had just been betrayed by the world. "This is my son's home!" she cried, her voice trembling, but still attempting to assert authority. "You have no right to sell it! None!" Janet stood silently at the corner of the table, not intervening. Her eyes briefly met mine, a quiet warning. "Don't let yourself be pulled back in." I said nothing. I only looked directly at Evelyn, where her rage mingled with confusion, a fury that had nothing left to hold on to. Jacob stood stunned, motionless as a statue. He turned to me, his face pale, his voice utterly lost. "Are you insane, Marian?" I looked at him, my heart suddenly as still as the bay's surface this morning. "No," I said. "I am clearer than I have ever been." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out in the air, a familiar gesture whenever he intended to soothe me. But this time, I neither retreated nor advanced. I just stood there, my eyes fixed on the space between us, the place where love once resided, now empty. "You don't understand," I said, my voice slow and distinct. "I was only doing what you forgot to do, protecting myself." The space froze. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Jacob looked at me, his gaze torn between disbelief and fear. Perhaps he had never considered the day I could walk away without tears, without a fight, armed only with a few pieces of paper and a silver key. I turned, stepping out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet. The last streaks of morning light reflected off the wet surface, cold and clear as metal. Behind me, Evelyn's voice rose again, softer now, fading into the air. "You will regret this, Marian. You cannot build happiness out of walking away." I turned back, my voice light without malice. "And you cannot hold on to happiness by taking it from someone else." The sentence drifted out, leaving no lingering anger, only the truth, cold, clear, and needing no justification. I took a deep breath. The wind from the sea rushed in, carrying the scent of salt, mixed with a faint sweetness. In my mind, all the sounds of the house retreated. The pouring of wine, the arguments, the faint sound of my own voice once begging to be heard. Now, all that remained was the sound of the waves, steady and free. I walked away, feeling as though I were leaving a smoke-filled room, the smoke of years of silence. It didn't sting, it was only blurry. For a moment, no one inside moved. The distant waves gently slapped the shore, as if reminding me that, no matter the chaos within, the world outside was calmly moving on. Howard looked down, his hands tightly clasped, his face heavy. Perhaps he understood more than he dared to say. This man, for all those years, had always chosen silence between the two women pulling against each other. I looked at him, seeing the shadow of a person who had tried to preserve harmony, and in return, lost his own voice. He looked up, met my eyes, and quietly nodded. Just a small nod, but enough for me to understand. He knew, and he didn't blame me. Janet placed the file down, her voice even and professional, yet with a hint of softness in her eyes. The sale is complete. The buyer takes possession next week. The sound of the paper hitting the tabletop was small, but in that moment it resonated louder than any scream. Evelyn looked at the stack of papers, her face pale. The dining table from this morning, the wine glasses, the stew, the melting candles, now looked like a battlefield left behind after a storm. Jacob still stood motionless. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Perhaps he realized all words were futile now. I saw his hand clench, his fingernails digging into his palm, like someone afraid of losing balance as the ground cracked beneath his feet. I walked slowly towards the door, the smell of damp wood, sea, and memory intertwining. My eyes scanned every corner, the cupboard, the photo, the new curtain. Everything was still there, but nothing called my name. I turned back, my voice low, clear, neither sad nor shaking. To keep your soul, sometimes you have to lose the roof over your head. No one replied. Only Janet, the only person in the room, gave a slight nod. A nod not of agreement, but of profound understanding. I picked up my bag and stepped over the threshold. The cold light from outside streamed in, reflecting faintly on my shoes. As my feet touched the porch, I heard the waves closer, the scent of salt stronger, and a rush of new air entered my lungs, harsh, raw, but real. Behind me I heard Evelyn's sigh, long and thin as the wind through the curtain. Jacob didn't call out. Howard didn't speak. The door closed softly, like the final punctuation mark of the old chapter. I walked down the small slope leading to the sand, the sky still gray but brighter. The sea stretched out before me, the waves beating steadily, each layer rolling onto the shore like a belated welcome. I took off my shoes, the cold, wet sand seeping between my toes. The sensation was immediate and real, like touching myself again. Behind my back, the house was only a fading shape. I didn't look back. A house can be lost, but a soul, if kept whole, will always find a new refuge. The wind blew, carrying the faint, distant scent of lavender. I inhaled deeply, taking another step, leaving the past where it belonged. The road to my mother's house stretched out, winding through rain-soaked birch groves. The scent of the earth after the storm was rich, cold yet clear. I drove slowly, the car window slightly ajar, letting the wind carry in the gentle sounds of a world freshly washed clean. With every mile I covered, I felt lighter, as if layers of dust were being scrubbed from my heart. My mother's house sat on the hillside, white-painted walls, low roof, perpetually scented with peppermint. She was there, in the wooden chair on the porch, knitting a scarf and waiting for me, as if no time had passed at all. When I stopped the car, she looked up, her smile small, tranquil, and asking no questions. I moved in with my mother. Stepping into that house, I heard the sound of the kettle boiling, the old clock ticking, and the wind sighing through the open window. There was no noise, no argument, only the smell of mint tea, a gentle fragrance that soothed my heart. She poured me a cup, slid it toward me, her voice low, steady, and warm as it had always been. "Drink this, dear. The flavor of peace never changes." I held the cup, the warmth radiating into my hands, the thin steam dissolving in the small space. Everything was so simple it was almost sacred. No advice needed, no questions asked, only presence. Only knowing there was still a place to sit down without being judged. After a moment, my mother placed her hand on the table, looking at me, her eyes deep and bright, as if understanding everything I hadn't said. "You did the right thing," she said, lightly but with a certainty in her voice that I had forgotten to feel for years. I didn't answer immediately. My lips trembled slightly. The clock on the wall ticked every second as if holding time still. "The right thing, Mom?" I whispered. "Even when I have nothing left?" She smiled, her eyes full of love. "You still have yourself. That is enough." The sentence touched a place I had kept locked away. I bowed my head and tears fell. They weren't tears of regret or hurt, but the tears that come when you know you have survived the storm. I nodded, my voice choked, yet clear. Love doesn't mean endurance. My mother held my hand, her palm wrinkled but warm, like a connection leading me back to myself. In that moment I understood that sometimes you have to lose everything to learn how to keep one thing, the self-respect of your own heart. Outside the clouds had broken, and the sun began to peek out from behind the ridge. The light shone diagonally through the window, hitting the mint tea, creating a gently glittering band. I closed my eyes, deeply inhaling the scent of peppermint, and for the first time in months, peace no longer felt like a distant luxury. The afternoon drifted by slowly, as if time itself was resting after the long rain. My mother had gone out to the garden to pick mint, leaving me alone in the warm kitchen. Golden light streamed through the window, reflecting on the tabletop, spreading out like tranquil water. I sat still, listening to the wind rustling on the porch, and the gentle sound of leaves brushing against each other. The sound of a world that no longer demanded anything from me. On the table, my phone vibrated softly. The screen lit up, displaying a name I once knew by heart. Jacob. I looked at it for a moment, not touching, but not avoiding it either. Finally, I opened it. The message was just one line. I was wrong. I just wanted peace. I read it twice. The words were brief, yet heavy. I just wanted peace. I smiled faintly, not in sarcasm but in understanding. Everything he had done, the silence, the avoidance, the acquiescence, giving his mother the power to decide, all stemmed from that. Peace. But that kind of peace could only be achieved if someone else was willing to bear the noise, to take the damage for him. I put the phone down, my finger lightly tracing the screen, then stopping on the delete icon. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then I pressed. I deleted the message. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed it for confirmation. I had understood. Peace cannot be built on the silence of others. It must be forged in truth, even if the truth sometimes hurts. I left the table, opening the window. The wind from the garden rushed in, carrying the freshly picked mint scent, cool and sharp. Outside, the sun was sinking lower, the afternoon light shining through the window, hitting the table, then casting itself onto my face. I touched my cheek. It was warm. It was real. In the window's reflection, I saw a woman who was no longer trembling, no longer seeking validation in the eyes of others. All that remained was a gentle stillness, the tranquility of someone who knows she has walked through a storm and remains standing. I inhaled deeply, feeling the wind weave through my hair, the light fall on my eyelashes, so serene that no words were needed. From the porch, my mother called, "Tea is ready, my love." I smiled, turning back, walking towards the sound, where there was the scent of mint tea, a warm hand, and a chapter of life beginning with true silence.
In the morning, mist clung to the hillside. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of mint my mother had harvested the night before. I was making tea when my phone vibrated softly, a text from Laura. Just a few brief lines. No exclamation points, no elaborate details. Marian, they are renting a small apartment near Portland, not far from the sea. I doubt his mother will be able to visit there. He's looking for a new job. I read it several times, the screen light reflected on the teacup, shimmering like a small ripple. Although Laura wasn't explicit, I knew she was trying to keep her tone light so as not to burden me. But in every word, there was still a deep note, fatigue, regret, and perhaps a touch of embarrassment for Jacob. I smiled and texted back. A small apartment is enough if there is honesty inside it. Then I put the phone down, listening to the wind sigh through the window frame. Outside in the garden, my mother was drying mint leaves, her hands trembling slightly but steadily. I watched her silhouette, seeing the quiet peace I was learning to possess. The second message arrived at noon. Evelyn is furious. She blames him for losing the house, said he doesn't deserve the Ellis name. He just stays silent. I read it, my heart growing still. The image of Evelyn formed in my mind, her straight posture, chin held high, eyes full of judgment. I imagined her walking through the empty house, touching the wall I had once painted, inhaling the damp wood smell, and realizing that everything was no longer under her control. Perhaps her pain wasn't from losing a residence, but from the first time in her life she had lost the power to decide anything. Jacob, perhaps, still sat listening, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands clenched, trying to prove his righteousness through silence. He once believed silence was peace, but now he must understand. It only allows others to speak for you. I poured another cup of tea, watching the steam rise, swirling in the air.
In the hazy vapor, I saw his face, tired, confused, but perhaps for the first time honest with himself. In the afternoon, Laura sent one more text. "He doesn't blame you," he said. "Maybe this is what needed to happen." I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed a short message. "He will be fine. People only truly grow up when they lose what they thought was permanent." I put the phone down, leaning back in my chair, my eyes directed toward the sky beyond the garden. The sunlight pierced through the clouds, shining onto the rain-soaked meadow, gleaming like a mirror. In that light, everything appeared real, the cracks, the dark corners, and the beauty that emerges when one no longer has to pretend to be strong. I spoke softly, half to myself, half sending it toward the distant sea where Jacob might be standing. He only now understands the feeling of being controlled. The sentence came out light as a breath, yet carried the salt taste of a long season. Not bitterness, but a belatedly acknowledged truth. The wind blew through, causing the teacup to gently stir, the surface rippling with light. I looked at it, thinking that some things have to break before people can begin to hear their true voice. I closed the phone, placing it aside, and sat still for a long time. There was no surge of joy as people often talk about after winning a battle. Only a prolonged stillness, gentle yet empty. I wasn't happy. I just felt light. As if I had finally put down a bag of stones I had carried for years without knowing. My shoulders still ached, but the afternoon wind had begun to touch my skin. My mother walked past the kitchen, seeing me sitting before the cold tea. She simply placed a hand on my shoulder, saying nothing. I nodded, enough for her to understand. Everything was calm. There was nothing to recount, no need for justification. This peace did not come from victory. but from letting go of what no longer belonged to me.
I opened the old leather journal, the one my mother gave me last Christmas, its paper edges slightly yellowed. Holding the pen, I wrote slowly, allowing the ink to spread out little by little like a quiet breath. No one wins a family war. I paused, looked at the sentence, then underlined it twice. Outside, the sky began to fade, the wind whistling through the pine trees into thin sounds like the whispers of the past. Perhaps Evelyn was now sitting in a new apartment, the stark white light replacing the warm glow of the house by the bay. Perhaps Jacob was thinking about the years of silence he mistook for love. Everyone remained within their own story, carrying scars and lessons. I closed the journal, placing it on the table. But at least, I spoke softly, as if only for myself to hear. I am no longer a prisoner of myself. From the window, I looked out. The sunset was approaching. Golden light spread over the grass, reflecting on the trembling mint leaves. I heard my mother call, "Dinner, dear!" Her voice was still warm, still low, still the sound of a true home. I smiled, put the pen away and stood up. In my heart I knew, life never stops having losses. It is only when we learn not to imprison ourselves in fear that we truly become free. I turned off the light, leaving the room in the last light of day, pale and peaceful.
Sunday morning, the sky was perfectly clear after a night of soft rain. The early sunlight streamed through the window frame, casting long, warm streaks on the wooden floor, like a gentle touch. My mother and I brought out the soil pots onto the porch. The earth was still damp, its earthy smell mixing with the mint tea scent drifting from the kitchen, creating that familiar aroma unique to this home. We replanted the lavender on the porch. The small pale purple shoots trembled slightly in the breeze. My mother said, "This flower survives because it knows how to bow its head at the right time, not because it's strong." I smiled, nodding softly, my fingers covered in mud, planting each small root into the soil. There was something profoundly peaceful about starting anew. No rush, no need to prove anything. Only the presence of my own hands and my own breath. I turned the soil, looked up, and saw the wind gently lift my mother's hair. The lavender scent wafted past, soft and sweet, spreading in the afternoon sun. There was no heavy perfume from the old house, no tense silence, only the smell of earth, the smell of flowers, and the normal rhythm of my own heart. "You know," my mother said, "when I was your age, I also thought my life would stop after the divorce. But then one morning I woke up, looked out at the garden, saw the light falling on the white daisies, and I knew there was still a part of me left to live." She paused for a moment. "The same goes for you, Marian. You still have a part left to live." I bent down, my hands still planting but my eyes stinging. For the first time, I didn't feel hurt anymore. I only felt myself, real, clear, and sufficient. In the late afternoon, with the lavender pots neatly lined up, the sun slanted low over the eaves. I sat down on the steps, watching them sway in the wind. The faint fragrance of the flowers drifted through the air, touching every empty space within me, healing from the inside out. I picked up my journal, opening it to the first blank page. The pen trembled in my hand, not from fear, but from the knowledge that from here on, every word I wrote would not be to please anyone else. I began to write the story of my life, not to accuse anyone, not to lament, nor to seek comfort. I simply wanted to record how an ordinary woman learned to stand up when love was no longer a refuge. I wrote slowly, in short sentences, interspersed with pauses for breath. I once thought love was where we belong, but perhaps It is only where we begin to learn how to return to ourselves. I looked up. The wind blew again, carrying the damp scent of lavender, covering the entire porch. My mother set a cup of tea down beside me, steaming gently. "What are you writing?" I smiled, replying softly, "Just rewriting everything, for the first time without needing anyone's approval." My mother smiled, looking distantly at the field. "Good. Right, dear. When you recount the pain, it gains a shape, and once it has a shape, it stops frightening you." I followed her gaze. In the sky, a few small birds flew towards the sea, silent and steady. I spoke quietly, almost a whisper. "Perhaps for the first time in my life, I am no longer invisible." The sky gradually turned violet. The small house was bathed in a soft light, orange blending with the lavender purple. I sat at the wooden table, the tea having gone cold, the scent of mint lingering in the air. In front of me was the paper filled with words, each page a piece of memory gently lifted from my heart, line by line, breath by breath. I reread what I had just written, then added a final line. "If anyone reads this, they will understand. Kindness needs boundaries." I put down the pen. The words were not meant for anyone else, but to remind myself that generosity does not mean letting others cross your limits. It is a conscious choice, not a forced sacrifice. I sat still, watching the wet ink spread slightly on the paper,
like the faint breath of someone who had just passed by. The wind outside the porch sighed softly, making the curtains sway gently. In the twilight, everything seemed to become more real, closer. On the table, the laptop was open to a local magazine's website, the Life and Reflections column. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the file, typing the title, "The Key I Shouldn't Have Given." The title came so naturally, as if I didn't think of it, but it found me. The silver key, the thing I had given away as a sign of trust, now became the symbol of a lesson learned. I had lost a home, lost a marriage, but found the most important thing, my own voice. I reread a passage from the draft. Sometimes, love is opening the door, but there are doors that need to be locked, not because we stop loving, but because we have learned how to hold on to ourselves. I hit send. The small click echoed, simple yet final, like the sound of closing an old chapter. I sat still, watching the screen go dark, feeling not excitement, but lightness. Like sending a part of my story out to live its own life. Outside, my mother was still watering the lavender pots. The last sunlight fell onto her gray hair, gleaming like threads of gold. I opened the window, inhaled the scent of the flowers deeply, and smiled faintly. No one knew if the article would be published, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had written. I had spoken. I was no longer silent. I put down the pen, closed the journal, and whispered to myself, "Perhaps I just opened the right door." On Thursday afternoon, the sky was covered in a thin layer of gray. It wasn't raining, but the air was so humid that every breath felt like it carried mist. I was folding a blanket when I heard my mother call from the porch. "Darling, you have mail." I walked out. On the wooden table, beneath my still warm teacup, lay a beige envelope, its edges slightly stained, the name, Marian, written in familiar handwriting. His script was shaky. I recognized it immediately, though it had been a long time since I'd seen it. I sat down, my fingers tracing the lines, feeling as though I was touching a memory I had tried to lock away. The envelope wasn't thick, just a single sheet of paper folded in half. Yet, it felt heavy, as if containing all the time we had spent lost. I opened the letter. The paper was slightly damp. Perhaps he had held it for too long before sending it. Marian, I wrote, and tore up this letter many times. Finally, I realized that what I feared was not losing you, but having to face myself. I paused. The handwriting was a scrawl. Some of the ink was blurred, perhaps because his hand was shaking, or perhaps due to tears. I thought that maintaining peace was love, but it turns out that silence is also a form of betrayal. I was afraid of saying something that would hurt everyone, so I chose silence. But when I was silent, you had to speak for everything. I left you standing alone amidst the things I should have protected. I read slowly, every word, hearing his voice in my head. Not the voice of a man begging for forgiveness, but of one who had finally seen the truth after a long, blinding fog. Mom is angry with me, saying I betrayed the family. But I think the first thing I betrayed was the love you believed in. Now this apartment is empty, and I finally understand what it means for a home to lose its soul. My hand gently gripped the edge of the paper. There was something profoundly human in his awkwardness. A man who didn't know how to love,
Only how to avoid fault, and who only began to learn how to speak the truth when everything fell apart. The rain began to fall in scattered drops, so light that one had to look closely to see it. The first drop landed on the envelope, spreading a damp smudge. I folded the letter back up, placing it next to the teacup. The steam still rose, thin and warm, much like the emotion inside me now, no longer boiling, but not yet cold. I didn't know whether I should be sad or whether I should forgive. I only knew that for the first time reading his words, I didn't feel small anymore. I looked at the silent paper, thinking that sometimes people only truly grow when they have the courage to look back at what they destroyed through silence. The wind blew, making the letter tremble slightly, like the final breath of what used to be. I leaned back in the chair, looking out the misted window, where the lavender stem still stood tall despite the light rain. I spoke softly, almost a whisper. Thank you for finally speaking. I sat still for a long time, not rereading it, nor folding it away immediately. Outside, the rain turned into small, steady drops falling on the eaves, murmuring like someone finishing the unfinished part of a story. There were no longer rough waves in my heart, only a quiet, empty space. I wasn't angry anymore, only felt a weary compassion, like someone who has just walked through a storm and knows they cannot hate the storm, because it taught them how to survive. I reached out and smoothed the edge of the paper, my eyes lingering on the final paragraph. I understand now, he wrote, his script smaller, trembling slightly as if afraid the words would break if emphasized too much. You deserve respect. I read that line over and over, not because I needed to hear it, but because it was the first time he truly spoke from his heart, not from fear or the habit of pleasing others. Some words come late, but they are still enough to close a chapter of life. I folded the letter, carefully, as if folding a memory. I placed it in the drawer with a few old photos, not to keep it, but to let it rest, no longer demanding to be recalled. My hand touched the teacup beside it. The water was cold, but the hint of mint scent still lingered. I took a deep breath, slowly exhaled, and then spoke softly, not directed at anyone, just a phrase for myself. Forgiveness is not because they deserve it, but because I need peace. The words fell into the air, blending with the rain and the dim light on the porch, gentle, yet real. I realized that forgiveness is not about removing the wound, but about stopping it from controlling you. No need to forget. Just no need to feel pain when remembering. I stood up, opening the window. The humid air rushed in, cool and fresh, carrying the scent of the lavender outside, a fragrance that had survived so many rains. The small purple blossoms bowed their heads in the wind, patient and tranquil. I let the wind touch my face, let the rain softly brush my hands. Somewhere deep inside,
A part of me subtly shifted, not turning back, but moving forward, quietly and brighter. In the distance, the sky broke open into a thin streak of light behind the clouds. I closed my eyes, letting my heart drift along, unhurried, unforced, just listening to my own breath and knowing that the storm had truly passed.
That morning, the sea was strangely calm. The sky was clear, the wind gentle, and the waves merely rippled, as if holding silence for something about to be closed. I drove along the Bay Road, the very path that had been marked by 2 sets of wheels on the day we moved in. The road was the same, except this time, I drove alone, and my heart was no longer heavy. When the old house appeared around the bend, I instinctively slowed down. The roof tiles were still dark brown, the walls still shadowed by old pine trees. But the porch now held new flower baskets, and the curtains had been changed to a cream color. Everything was both familiar and strange, like a scene from a dream faded by time. I stopped the car at the entrance, sitting for a moment before stepping out. Not to gather courage, just to be grateful for the calmness I had always wished for. That house was once my heart, and now I had only come to say a proper goodbye. I returned to the old house, now occupied by others. Through the window, I saw the silhouettes of 2 children running around the living room, their laughter bright and clear. A young woman was hanging a new painting on the wall. The sight made me smile. Life had chosen others to continue, and I was merely passing by for a final look. I walked up the steps to the porch, taking a small card from my jacket pocket. On it, I had written in a slow, steady script, without tremor. This house once held both love and deceit. Use this key wisely. I placed the card down, along with a small envelope containing the last silver key. It lay still on the wooden floor. The morning light shone on it, making the metal briefly gleam. Then it settled, just like myself. The wind from the sea swept up, gently lifting my hair. I stood there for a few seconds, looking around. The lavender bushes I had planted were still there in the corner of the garden, flashes of purple amongst the weeds. I didn't step inside. Just knowing they survived was enough. I spoke softly, my voice low and even. Thank you for once being home. No tears, no regrets, only gratitude. Because sometimes, the places that once hurt us are exactly where we learn to be strong. I turned and walked down the steps. Behind me, the house gradually receded in the morning light. The wind carried the scent of the sea and damp wood, mingling in the air. The smell of closure, but not of loss. On my hand, there was still a faint sheen where the key had touched. I looked at it and smiled. Perhaps it was the last trace of something now complete. I stayed for a moment on the small slope overlooking the bay. The sun was rising. The sun was rising higher. The sea murmured. The waves steady like the breathing of the old world I was leaving behind. The sunlight turned the porch railing a deep red, the light sliding across the doorframe, across the wild daisies growing by the fence, and across the card I had just left. Everything was stained with the same hue, the color of an ending, but also the color of life moving on. I inhaled deeply, the salty air mixed with the distant scent of lavender. My heart was no longer sinking, unlike the last time I left. No hatred, no sorrow, just a gentle human stillness, the peace that arrives after all the storms have left the heart. I turned my back, slowly walking down the slope. Under my feet, the gravel crunched, a familiar and comforting sound.
With every step, I felt my shoulders lighten. Behind me, the house still stood, shrinking in the afternoon light. But this time, I didn't need to look back again. I knew it had become a part of the story, no longer a place where I had to prove anything. A soft smile touched my lips, neither proud nor sad. Just an acknowledgement that I had lived, I had loved, and I had learned how to stop at the right time. Inside, all bitterness dissolved, like salt into waves, leaving only the taste of what is true. I stopped one last time, turning my face toward the bay. The water reflected the changing sky, violet, amber,
then dissolving into deep blue. I spoke softly, not directed at anyone, just a farewell phrase. Some doors don't close because of anger, but because finally, we've learned to hold on to ourselves. The words dissolved into the wind, but their sound remained within me, like the final chord of a long journey. I walked on, my shadow stretching along the sloping road blending into the twilight. The sea still sang behind me, and for the first time, I heard it not as a sound of separation, but as a hymn of thanks. At the horizon, the sun slowly sank into the water, leaving a shimmering streak of light like a golden thread. I knew this wasn't the end. It was just one door closing to open another, quieter, truer, belonging to me. Some stories don't require a perfect ending. They only need a person calm enough to close the door, with gratitude, not regret. Marian walked through stormy days, lost a home, lost a husband. But what she found was herself, the woman who had been minimized within her own love. If you have ever been in a relationship that forced you into silence just to keep the peace, remember this. Peace isn't the absence of a voice. It's the moment you dare to speak your truth. Because some doors close to protect what love failed to. Some doors must be locked, so that we may keep our own hearts whole. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you are, or what struck you most about Marian's journey. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next stories. The stories of women just like us, who have fallen, and still chose to rise, with a heart unbroken.